The courtyard was silent. But it was not peace that settled over Buckingham Palace that afternoon. It was restraint, behind its gilded gates, beneath ceilings painted with centuries of triumph and tragedy. Something almost imperceptible had shifted. Not a scandal. Not yet. Not a headline. Just 3 minutes inside a private corridor, and a child fighting back tears she had been raised never to show. At the center of it stood Princess Charlotte of Wales. Young, composed, already carrying the invisible arithmetic of succession, and across from her, a figure of unquestioned authority. Queen Camilla. No voices were heard beyond the walls. No door slammed. No spectacle disturbed the afternoon light. But a line, ancient, delicate, sacred, may have been crossed. Within the hour, a senior protection officer would deliver a sealed memorandum to Princess Anne. It would contain timestamps, observations, one carefully chosen word, distress. And in a monarchy built on hierarchy, symbolism, and silence, a single moment of visible emotion can echo louder than any proclamation. Because when authority confronts innocence inside the crown's own walls, the question is no longer about discipline. It is about legacy. The courtyard was silent now, but the echo of that exchange still lingered in the private corridors of Buckingham Palace. It had lasted only minutes. No doors were slammed. No voices carried beyond regulation thickness of carved oak and stone. And yet, within those carefully insulated walls, something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. At 14:12 hours, according to internal security notation, a routine rehearsal concluded inside the north corridor adjoining the private family apartments. The afternoon light filtered through tall sash windows, pale and restrained, touching gold-framed portraits and polished floors with ceremonial calm. Palace aides moved with quiet efficiency, gathering briefing papers and confirming evening arrangements. At 14:14 hours, tone changed. It was not shouting. It was not disorder. It was authority sharpened. Present in that corridor was Princess Charlotte of Wales. Young, attentive, already trained to stand with shoulders square and chin level, as generations before her had done. She had been practicing posture for an upcoming state appearance. Correction was expected in such rehearsals. Precision was tradition, but precision, when pressed too firmly, can fracture composure. Opposite her stood Queen Camilla, consort, senior royal, custodian of present influence within the institution. Her presence carried formal authority. Her voice, measured by design, rarely needed volume to command compliance. Witnesses would later describe the exchange as firm. That word appeared twice in the internal memorandum. At 14:15 hours, the memorandum recorded a change in demeanor. The child's composure faltered. Not dramatically, not publicly, but visibly. A tightening of breath, a tremor held back, eyes lowered not in rehearsal, but in restraint. The echo of boots on marble had paused as protection officers instinctively registered the shift. They did not intervene. There was no breach of safety protocol, no physical contact, no actionable security violation. And yet, something in the air had altered. One phrase, later recounted in summary, lingered longer than the rest. She must learn her place in the hierarchy of women within this institution. Hierarchy within a monarchy. Hierarchy is law. It is structure. It is survival. But hierarchy between sovereign and heir is codified in constitutional clarity. It is not interpreted. It is not improvised. The moment concluded without spectacle. Aides were dismissed. Doors closed. Routine resumed. But the silence that followed was not ordinary palace silence. It was aware. At 15:02 hours, a senior royal protection officer requested audience with Princess Anne inside her private office and stood near the window overlooking the inner quadrangle. She had always favored work over ceremony, structure over indulgence. Her posture mirrored discipline learned not from comfort, but from example. When the officer entered, he carried no visible urgency, only an envelope. The report, ma'am. She studied him before accepting it. Years among military regiments had taught her the language of stillness. This was not routine documentation. Is this procedural? She asked. Yes, ma'am. Is it necessary? A pause. Yes, ma'am. That answer was enough. She broke the seal. The document was precise. Time stamps aligned to internal systems. Witness placement cross-reference with guard rotation. No emotional adjectives. No speculation. Only fact. As she read, the room seemed to narrow. 14:12 hours. Verbal exchange initiated. 14:14 hours. Elevated corrective tone observed. 14:15 hours. Minor Royal displayed visible emotional distress and did not react outwardly. Her training, lifelong instinctive, did not allow reaction before comprehension. You witnessed this yourself? She asked. Yes, ma'am. Was protocol breached? No, ma'am. Was safety compromised? No, ma'am. She folded the paper once, deliberately. Then why am I reading it? The officer did not hesitate. Because, ma'am, the tone extended beyond correction. The fire in the hearth shifted softly. Anne's gaze sharpened, but her voice remained level. Who else was present? 2 aides, both dismissed before conclusion. Standard corridor surveillance active. Archived. Yes, ma'am. Silence returned. Thicker now. Across the palace, beyond the paneled walls and security layers, the child's wing had resumed its gentle rhythm. A governess reading. A lamp switched on early against the gray London sky. Routine restored by design. But routine could not erase memory. And turned back to the report. A final notation caught her attention. Guard positioning. Adjusted 30 minutes prior to incident. Adjusted, not scheduled. She read it again. Adjusted. Guard rotations inside the palace followed established sequence. Alterations required authorization. Documentation. Who authorized this adjustment? She asked quietly. The officer straightened. Request pending verification, ma'am. That was the first true fracture in the afternoon's composure. Because timing matters inside institutions built on choreography. If positioning changed before the exchange occurred, then the exchange might not have been entirely spontaneous. And walked slowly to her desk and placed the report flat against polished wood. The monarchy had survived abdications, public scandal, political transformation. It did not destabilize from stern correction, but it could erode from subtle repositioning. She thought briefly of her brother, King Charles III, carrying sovereign weight heavier than any crown. She thought of the line of succession embodied not in theory, but in children navigating expectation before adolescence. And she thought of duty. Duty did not bend toward comfort. It bent toward preservation. Prepare a full written account, she instructed. Include corridor footage timestamps, guard rotation confirmation, and any authorization requests logged within 1 hour prior. Yes, ma'am. The officer exited and remained alone outside the tall windows. Tourists gathered along the gates, lifting cameras toward illuminated stone. They would see ceremony, precision, continuity. They would not see the internal recalibration unfolding within. Hours later, as evening settled over London, the palace corridors felt colder, not physically, but perceptibly. Staff members sensed inquiry, without being told. Doors closed more softly. Conversations shortened. The institution tightening itself around an unseen center. Meanwhile, within her private sitting room, Queen Camilla reviewed correspondence for the following week's engagements. There was no outward sign of disruption. No summons had yet arrived. Because, and did not believe in reaction without evidence. She believed in documentation, in clarity, in sequence. The new report arrived shortly before 1900 hours. This one thicker, detailed. It confirmed the earlier summary but added structure. The guard adjustment request had been submitted verbally, unusual, but not prohibited, by a senior household aide attached temporarily to the Queen's staff. No written authorization logged. No justification recorded beyond logistical preference. Anne's expression did not change, but her mind aligned pieces carefully. If corridor positioning had been altered, if aides were dismissed early, if tone exceeded rehearsal correction, then the moment was no longer simply emotional. It was intentional. And intention within a monarchy carries consequence far beyond immediate exchange. She stood once more and approached the window. The palace facade glowed against night sky, controlled, dignified, immovable. Yet inside, currents move quietly beneath polished floors. When authority confronts innocence within such walls, resolution must be precise, not explosive, not humiliating. Precise. She returned to her desk and wrote a single line across the final page of the memorandum. Request formal clarification from Her Majesty regarding purpose of guard adjustment prior to rehearsal. The pen did not tremble. The line was even. Outside, the guard changed rotation exactly on the hour, boots striking stone in synchronized rhythm, discipline made audible. But inside the institution, something deeper had begun. Not scandal, not rebellion. Inquiry. Because 3 minutes in a corridor may pass unnoticed by the world. Yet within a monarchy built upon symbolism, those 3 minutes can redraw invisible boundaries. Princess extinguished the desk lamp. Darkness settled gently around the room. Her decision had not been emotional. It had been structural. And structure, when quietly reinforced, preserves crowns more effectively than outrage ever could. What Princess would soon uncover in the rotation logs, a discrepancy too precise to ignore, would suggest that the silence in that corridor had not been accidental but arranged. The silence from the previous evening had not dissolved with sunrise. It had settled deeper into the stone. Morning light crept slowly across the eastern facade of Buckingham Palace, illuminating balconies and ironwork as if nothing within it shifted. Tourists gathered as usual beyond the gates. Cameras flashed. The flag above the palace moved gently in the February wind. But inside, documentation had begun. The corridor where the exchange occurred remained operational. Staff passed through it. Aides delivered correspondence. Security officers maintained their measured patrol. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, attention had sharpened. Every timestamp now mattered. Inside her private office, Princess reviewed the full incident memorandum delivered at 6:40 hours. It was no longer a brief summary. It was structured, chronological, annotated with procedural references to royal household conduct statutes and internal safeguarding guidance for minor members of the royal family. And did not rush. She read the report once in full. Then again, slower. 14:07 hours. Guard rotation schedule amended. 14:12 hours. Rehearsal concluded. 14:14 hours. Elevated corrective tone documented. 14:15 hours. Minor royal displayed visible distress. 14:16 hours. Corridor cleared. 14:18 hours. Queen's a departed wing. Each entry aligned to surveillance log verification. There were no missing minutes. But the adjustment at 14:07 remained anomalous. Guard rotations inside the palace were not improvised. They followed codified patterns designed around visibility, proximity, and deterrence. Alterations were possible, but logged. This alteration had been requested verbally by a senior aide attached to Queen Camilla's household. No written justification. Only a brief notation. Positioning preference for privacy. Privacy. And leaned back slightly in her chair. Privacy in royal residences was common, necessary, but privacy within a monitored corridor adjoining the apartments of a direct heir required coordination, particularly when that heir was Princess Charlotte of Wales. Charlotte's status was not symbolic alone. She was fourth in line to the throne, daughter of Prince William, Prince of Wales, and therefore subject to safeguarding protocols distinct from standard household members. And turn to the appendix section. There, attached in formal language, was a citation from the Minor Royal Safeguarding Memorandum, an internal document revised after prior public controversies decades earlier. It emphasized 3 principles: protection of physical safety, protection of emotional stability, protection of constitutional symbolism. The third principle was often overlooked by those outside the institution. But inside, symbolism carried measurable weight. An heir's public composure reflected continuity. Their visible vulnerability, if mishandled, risked misinterpretation. And's gaze returned to the witness statements. The first aide described the exchange as corrective but prolonged. The second used a phrase toned beyond rehearsal necessity. Neither offered opinion. Both maintained loyalty in wording. Yet both confirmed the same detail. The phrase referencing hierarchy of women within this institution had been spoken, and underlined it lightly in pencil. Hierarchy among women. In constitutional structure, the hierarchy was defined by succession, not gender positioning. Queen consort did not supersede heir. Authority in rehearsal context could be asserted. Authority over symbolic standing could not. The camera drifts through archival corridors now, through shelves of leather-bound volumes recording precedent. Abdication papers, regency advisories, guardianship statutes. Monarchy endured through documentation, not emotion, and requested access to corridor footage. At 8:15 hours, within a secured review chamber, screens illuminated in controlled sequence. No audio, standard privacy measure for family zones, but visual clarity sufficient. The footage confirmed what the report described. Charlotte stood centered, posture straight. Camilla positioned slightly offset, gesturing, instructive, deliberate. At 14:14, body language shifted. Charlotte's shoulders tightened. Her chin lowered fractionally. Not rehearsal adjustment, but internal withdrawal. Camilla's stance remained composed, measured, but firm beyond rehearsal brevity. At 14:15, Charlotte blinked rapidly, a child's effort to regain control. There was no spectacle, no aggression, but the emotional pivot was unmistakable. And watched the sequence twice, then a third time. She did not search for fault alone. She searched for intention. At 14:07, footage showed the guard repositioning. He stepped 6 feet further down the corridor, reducing visible proximity to the rehearsal space. Not removal, but distance. Distance creates privacy. Privacy enables candor. Candor, when unmoderated, can sharpen and turned off the screen. Confirm authorization chain for that adjustment. She instructed the security director present. Yes, ma'am. Back in her office, she reviewed the ceremonial precedence manual, a document rarely consulted outside state planning sessions. It outlined seating arrangements, procession order, modes of address. Under no circumstance did it imply hierarchical correction of a direct heir by a consort regarding institutional standing. Correction in behavior, yes. Instruction in decorum, yes. But symbolic positioning was constitutionally delicate. Hours later, confirmation arrived. The aide who requested the guard shift had done so directly following a brief private consultation with Camilla earlier that morning. No formal documentation, recorded the reason, and folded her hands. This was no longer a matter of tone alone. It was pattern, a subtle preparation for privacy before correction, and correction that extended into institutional language. She rose and walked toward the long corridor connecting administrative offices to the older archival wing. The palace seemed quieter than usual. Staff moved with deference sharpened by awareness. Word had not spread in rumor, and would not permit that, but inquiry at her level generated atmosphere. Inside the archival chamber, she requested prior advisory letters regarding safeguarding of minor royals. One sealed document from years earlier surfaced, drafted during heightened public scrutiny involving generational tensions within the monarchy. It emphasized that direct heirs must never be placed in positions where authority appeared to eclipse succession legitimacy, not publicly, not privately in ways that could distort internal understanding. And read the passage carefully. Internal clarity preserves external confidence. She closed the folder slowly. The question forming in her mind was no longer whether Camilla had overstepped emotionally. It was whether, intentionally or not, she had blurred structural boundaries, and blurred boundaries, if left unaddressed, could evolve into precedent. By late afternoon, and summoned the security director once more. Was there any prior request for corridor privacy that week? No, ma'am. Any deviation from standard rehearsal protocol? No, ma'am. She nodded once. The investigation had not produced scandal. It had produced alignment. Guard repositioned. Aides dismissed. Language extended beyond posture. All within a controlled window of privacy. And returned to her desk and drafted a formal request. Not accusatory. Not emotional. Structured. Request private audience with Her Majesty to clarify context and intention of 1412 corridor exchange and pre-incident guard adjustment. She signed it without flourish. This would not be rumor. It would not be whispered interpretation. It would be addressed within walls designed to withstand centuries. As evening approached, The palace exterior once again glowed under carefully placed illumination. Visitors outside saw only grandeur. Inside, process moved steadily. Charlotte, meanwhile, had resumed lessons, her schedule undisturbed, her composure restored in appearance. Children of monarchy learned resilience early, but resilience should not be confused with immunity, and understood that better than most. Before leaving her office for the evening, she reviewed one final detail in the security log. The aide who requested the guard shift had accessed the corridor precisely 3 minutes before Camilla arrived. 3 minutes, a preparation window. Not long, but deliberate, and closed the file. This was no longer about raised tone. It was about structural awareness. And tomorrow, behind closed doors, that awareness would be tested. When Princess requested a sealed audience with the Queen, it was no longer a question of emotion. It was a question of institutional boundary, and the confrontation that awaited would determine whether those boundaries still held. The palace was quieter than usual the morning the audience was granted, not outwardly, not to the world beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. The changing of the guard proceeded with ceremonial precision. Carriages moved through the forecourt. Schedules unfolded as printed. But inside the older wing, the wing reserved for private council, the air felt measured. Princess did not rush. She walked the length of the corridor with the same steady cadence she had maintained her entire life. No visible tension, no haste, yet every step carried awareness. The previous chapter had been about documentation. This one would be about intention. The drawing room selected for the meeting was not large, but it was deliberate. High ceilings softened by muted tapestries. 2 armchairs positioned opposite one another. A low table between them. No aides present. No note-takers. No devices. Privacy, but not secrecy. At precisely 11 o'clock, Queen Camilla entered. Her composure was intact. Expression calm. She carried herself with the assurance of someone long accustomed to scrutiny and survival within it. And she greeted evenly, "Ma'am," and replied with equal restraint. They sat. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not hostile. It was evaluative, and began. "I have reviewed the security memorandum concerning the North Corridor rehearsal." Camilla's expression did not shift. "I assumed you might," she said quietly. There was no denial, no evasion, and folded her hands lightly in her lap. Nothing within the palace was ever entirely unseen, and what was observed could be interpreted. "Are you suggesting impropriety?" Camilla asked quietly. "I am suggesting," and replied, "that perception within an institution built on symbolism is not trivial." Camilla's voice cooled. "You are implying that I endangered optics." "I am stating," and said evenly, "that optics and legitimacy are intertwined." The fire shifted again. Neither woman moved. This was not a personal quarrel. It was structural debate. Camilla stood slowly and crossed toward the tall window, overlooking the inner quadrangle. "You have always favored rigidity," she said, not unkindly. "But rigidity can isolate and remain seated. An overreach can destabilize." Camilla turned back. "I corrected a child," she said, firmly. "You prepared the corridor for privacy, and responded. You dismissed aides. You referenced internal hierarchy beyond decorum. Each detail placed carefully, like pieces on a chessboard." Camilla did not deny it, because denial would contradict documentation. Instead, she changed angle. "Is this truly about Charlotte?" she asked, and held her gaze. "It is about precedent." There it was, the word neither of them could ignore. Precedent shapes expectation. Expectation shapes conduct. Conduct shapes continuity. Camilla returned to her seat. "For years," she said quietly, "I have endured perception without protection. I have been patient. Respect is not always given freely." Anne's expression softened, but only slightly. "This is not about your endurance," she said. "It is about her inheritance." The room fell silent again. Camilla's voice lowered. She must understand strength. Anne's reply was immediate. She must understand security. A longer silence followed. Then Anne spoke the words that shifted the ground beneath the conversation. The incident was observed through standard corridor oversight. Camilla's eyes flickered. Observed, she repeated. Yes. Not recorded for public scrutiny. Not weaponized, but documented. The moral tension crested, because the issue was no longer confined to personal interpretation. It was institutional record. Camilla leaned back slowly. I would appreciate clarity regarding the request to reposition guard coverage prior to that exchange. Camilla tilted her head slightly. I desired privacy for correction, she answered. It was not theatrical. It was instructional. Privacy, and repeated, within the apartments of a direct heir. A fractional pause. Yes. The fire in the hearth gave a soft crack, the only sound in the room beyond breath, and did not raise her voice. Was the correction limited to posture? Camilla's gaze remained steady. No, it extended to composure. And hierarchy? A subtle tightening at the edge of Camilla's eyes. I reminded her, she said, that understanding one's position within this institution is essential. Discipline now prevents confusion later. There it was. Not apology, not regret, conviction, and leaned back slightly. Charlotte understands her position, she said evenly. She has been raised within its parameters since birth. And yet, Camilla replied, she is still a child. Children test boundaries. Anne's gaze sharpened, though her tone did not. Succession is not a boundary to be tested. The words hung between them, measured, precise. Camilla inhaled slowly. I did not challenge succession, she said. I reinforced decorum. By referencing hierarchy among women, the room felt smaller now. Camilla's posture remained composed, but current defensiveness flickered beneath her calm. And, she said, this institution is not sustained by sentiment. It is sustained by structure. She must learn respect. Respect, Anne replied, is distinct from positioning. Silence. Outside, somewhere distant in the palace courtyard, boots struck stone in synchronized rhythm, the steady reassurance of routine. Inside, the confrontation sharpened, and reached to the table and placed a thin folder upon it. I have reviewed the corridor footage, she said. There was visible distress. Camilla's jaw tightened, barely perceptible. Momentary. She said, yes, and agreed. Momentary. A beat passed, but observed. That word carried weight. Camilla understood what it implied. You intend to escalate this. I intend, and replied calmly, to protect clarity. The distinction mattered. Camilla studied her. And what does clarity require? And did not hesitate. A formal internal review. The words landed quietly, but heavily, within the royal household. Internal review was not scandal. It was mechanism, but it signaled seriousness. Camilla exhaled slowly. For 3 minutes in a corridor, she said. For 3 minutes, and answered, that may shape perception for years. The truth beneath both positions pulsed unspoken. Power within monarchy is rarely loud. It is layered. Camilla's gaze drifted briefly toward the portraits lining the wall. Queens, consorts, sovereigns who had navigated scrutiny far harsher than this. Do you question my loyalty? She asked. No, and replied instantly. Then what do you question? Judgment. The words settled between them with finality. Camilla did not respond immediately. Instead, she nodded once, slowly. I believe privacy would allow firmness without spectacle. And privacy, and said gently, also removes witnesses who might contextualize tone. Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, and stood now, mirroring her. This is not condemnation, she said. It is containment. Camilla's voice softened. And if the review finds no breach, then the matter closes, and replied, quietly. The promise was genuine. There would be no humiliation, no leak, no fracture displayed to the public, but boundaries would be reaffirmed. The weight of that realization settled visibly across Camilla's expression, because isolation within palace corridors can be subtle. And today, subtle shifts were occurring. Very well, Camilla said finally, proceed. It was not surrender. It was calculation, and inclined her head. Thank you, ma'am. The meeting concluded without raised voices, without accusation, but with gravity. As an exited the drawing room, the corridor beyond felt longer than before. The camera follows her measured stride past gilded mirrors and silent guards, as the architecture of monarchy looms around her like stone memory. Behind her, inside the room now empty, Camilla remained standing for a moment longer, composed, but aware. The issue was no longer personal correction. It had become institutional inquiry. By late afternoon, and submitted formal notice to the Crown's Internal Review Council, a discreet body rarely activated, designed to examine procedural concerns without public trace. The notice was brief. It referenced safeguarding statutes, guard rotation anomalies, language extending beyond rehearsal scope, no accusation, only request for evaluation. And with that single submission, the matter moved beyond private disagreement. It entered structure that answered not to emotion, but to preservation. As evening settled over Buckingham Palace once more, the palace lights shimmered against the dark. Charlotte's wing remained undisturbed. Lessons continued, routine intact. But within the deeper chambers of the institution, scrutiny had begun, and scrutiny, even when quiet, has consequence. When Princess invoked the authority of the Crown's Internal Review Council, the issue ceased to be a family disagreement and became a question of institutional balance, one that would cast longer shadows through the state apartments than anyone had anticipated. The corridors of Buckingham Palace had grown colder, not in temperature, but in tone. The polished marble floors reflected the pale winter light filtering through tall windows, yet the sparkle seemed subdued, as though aware that history and secrecy were moving quietly beneath its surface. Princess walked alone through the state apartments. The echoes of her footsteps carried through the vast spaces like measured punctuation. Portraits of past sovereigns, kings and queens long gone, stared down from gilded frames. Each gaze a reminder of continuity, duty, and the unyielding weight of legacy. It was here, among the symbols of monarchy, that and contemplated the tension between authority and protection. The Internal Review Council had convened discreetly. Their reports, though confidential, began to ripple through palace staff. Senior aides revisited archive correspondences, letters between generations, prior incidents long buried. Every document hinted at patterns, alliances, and unwritten understandings between royal households, and studied them with precision, weighing loyalty against responsibility, observation against discretion. Camilla's presence within the palace shifted imperceptibly. Courtiers and household staff, who had long balanced their allegiances with caution, now navigate an atmosphere of subtle recalibration. Conversations were clipped, and glances carried unspoken questions, and understood the silent recalibration. Power, in these walls, often moved in shadows rather than declarations. A sealed advisory letter surfaced during the archival review, a directive regarding the safeguarding of minor royals. It reframed the confrontation from mere emotional misjudgment to a matter of constitutional optics. The language was careful, legalistic, yet the implications were profound. Any perception of authority over a direct heir could compromise the monarchy's stability. And paused at a long table, her fingers tracing the edge of the letter. She thought of her father's lessons. Restraint, duty, service above personal sentiment. She had always understood that the strength of the crown was not in dominance, but in disciplined guardianship. And now, faced with both precedent and observation, she realized that protecting Charlotte was not only personal but constitutional. Within the palace corridors, staff subtly adjusted their movements. Camilla, aware of the quiet shifts around her, felt an isolation that was almost imperceptible, polite, yet palpable. Influence had not been removed, but it had been counterbalanced by scrutiny. Even the smallest deviation in protocol carried weight now, and those who once acted freely now measured each step, each word, and continued a review of ceremonial guardianship guidelines. Most had been familiar, studied during countless rehearsals and official events, but a minor, overlooked clause caught her attention. It granted her authority in circumstances where a minor royal's well-being intersected with institutional optics, a leverage previously unnoticed. This discovery subtly altered the balance. It was not public, it was not dramatic, but in the hierarchy of the monarchy, it was significant. And reflection on past generations, the lessons passed silently from sovereign to heir, framed the path forward. Any action taken would be measured, discreet, and precise. As evening approached, the palace seemed to hold its breath. The chandeliers glimmered, reflecting the accumulated weight of centuries. Footsteps in distant corridors echoed, not only through stone, but through the unspoken consciousness of all who served within these walls. And returned to her private office. She reviewed each report, each advisory, and each subtle shift in protocol. The shadows cast by the chandeliers seemed deeper than usual, mirroring the subtle but significant consequences of the confrontation. Her mind traced possibilities, outcomes, and contingencies. Each potential action had ripple effects, some immediate, some unseen for months or years. Within this careful orchestration, and understood her role. The crown must remain unbroken, its heirs protected, and precedent carefully maintained. Authority and innocence, discipline and freedom, perception and truth, all coexisted in delicate tension. The palace, with its centuries of stone and gilded surfaces, absorbed it silently as she prepared her notes for the next stage of review and felt the quiet power of unseen leverage. A minor clause, a procedural oversight, a careful observation. Any of these could guide outcomes without a single word reaching the public. The palace had always operated this way. Visible grandeur masking invisible currents. Tonight, those currents would shift ever so slightly. Anne's awareness of precedent, of institutional leverage, and of her responsibility to the young princess positioned her to act with precision. In the shadows of the state apartments, decisions were made quietly, but their consequences extended far beyond polished floors and gilded walls. Anne's discovery of overlooked guardianship authority had granted her quiet leverage over the situation. What she chose to do next would determine how the balance of power, duty, and protection would unfold, and which invisible boundaries within the palace would be reinforced. The palace had regained its outward composure. Marble floors gleamed under the soft morning light. Chandeliers sparkled without interruption, and the familiar rhythm of steps along the corridors resumed. Buckingham Palace appeared unchanged to the casual observer. Yet beneath the surface, the careful machinery of the monarchy had been set in motion and recalibrated. Princess sat quietly in her private office, reviewing the final notes from the Crown's Internal Review Council. The documentation was thorough, impartial, and meticulously aligned with safeguarding statutes. Each timestamp, each statement, each minor deviation in protocol had been examined. The report's conclusions were precise. No public breach had occurred, no security lapse existed, and the child's welfare remained intact. The concern was procedural, about the perception and maintenance of hierarchy, not morality or intent. Camilla had been called to a discreet meeting. No accusations, no reprimands, no public announcement. The discussion had been measured, formal, and focused on establishing clarity, and emphasized boundaries rather than blame, ensuring the queen consort understood the importance of structural restraint when interacting with a direct heir. Camilla, composed as ever, accepted the clarification with acknowledgement but without resentment, a subtle sign that the monarchy's internal equilibrium remained unbroken. Charlotte, meanwhile, continued her lessons, her schedule uninterrupted, her composure intact. No one spoke of the previous incident in her presence. She was unaware of the scrutiny she had endured, and yet her guardianship had been reaffirmed, physically, symbolically, and emotionally, and had ensured that the child's experience remained private, a protective barrier between observation and exposure, and documented each step herself, confirming that the palace hierarchy and protocol were reinforced without public attention. William received a measured briefing, factual, concise, and devoid of sensationalism. His concern was for Charlotte's well-being, but he trusted Anne's judgment implicitly. The generational line was safeguarded not through spectacle, but through the quiet, deliberate maintenance of duty. Even the staff felt the shift. Subtle recalibration in protocol and conduct took hold without fanfare. Courtiers and aides adjusted their behavior naturally, responding to the reinforced clarity of hierarchy. Influence was balanced, and the palace's rhythm returned to its practiced cadence. As dusk settled, and found herself alone in her office, the lamps cast soft, golden light across the polished surfaces, and the weight of her responsibility pressed gently but steadily upon her. She reflected on the subtle power of discretion, the necessity of measured action, and the quiet reinforcement of order. Duty had been prioritized over comfort, preservation over confrontation, and the crown's legacy over immediate motion. She allowed herself a single deep exhale. The palace was calm. The child was protected. The institution remained intact, with boundaries quietly reinforced and order restored, and reflection turned inward. The real question remained: what does true strength demand when the preservation of legacy comes at the cost of personal ease? The night over Buckingham Palace was still, almost reverent. Outside, the London skyline glimmered faintly through winter fog. Inside, the corridors were silent, the echoes of steps absorbed by centuries of stone and history. The palace appeared at peace. Yet peace in the monarchy is rarely mere absence of disturbance. It is the careful orchestration of vigilance, discretion, and restraint. Princess sat by a single lamp, reviewing the events of the past days. Her mind traced each movement, each protocol decision, each nuanced gesture. The lessons of duty, learned from her father and forged through decades of public and private service, had guided every action she took. She understood that power is visible, but responsibility is often invisible. It is measured not in public approval, but in the quiet protection of those who carry the future within them. She reflected on Princess Charlotte of Wales, her composure, her resilience, and her innocence. Charlotte's small presence carried enormous significance. In every gesture, every observed smile, and every rehearsal protocol, she embodied continuity. And yet, that continuity could only be preserved if those around her acted with discipline and foresight. It was a burden and had accepted willingly, to protect, to guide, and to maintain clarity without intrusion. The events of the corridor, the recorded moments of tension, and the deliberate review of protocols were now quiet lessons etched into the institution. They would remain unseen by the public eye, but within the palace, their effect was profound. Authority and restraint, duty and morality, perception and reality, all had been aligned without drama, without scandal. The monarchy's strength had been quietly affirmed, and thought further legacy. It is rarely shaped by grand gestures. It is forged in silence, in decisions made without applause. Guardianship requires patience, precision, and the willingness to prioritize principle over emotion, to act without recognition, to intervene without spectacle, is the truest form of power within a system built on centuries of symbolism. She allowed herself a rare pause. The lamp's glow highlighted the lines of experience on her face, the traces of a life devoted to service. She understood that sometimes the greatest statements are made not by words, but by measured action, subtle guidance, and unwavering adherence to principle. Charlotte's security, both symbolic and personal, had been ensured without disturbance. Camilla's authority remained intact, tempered now by clarity. The institution endured, unbroken and resilient. The quiet weight of responsibility settled over, and deeper than any crown could sit. The invisible crown she bore was heavier than any visible ornament. It demanded patience, wisdom, and unwavering commitment. It demanded vigilance in moments when the world sees only calm. As she rose and looked toward the palace windows, the lamps outside shimmered like distant stars. Tomorrow would bring another day, another set of challenges, another test of duty. But tonight, the work was complete. The balance between authority and innocence, tradition and discretion, had been maintained. The monarchy had been preserved through silent guardianship,